drawing a scene such as this that has a lot of detail, quite a lot of complex detail, both because of what this building is, but also particularly the angle with which we're viewing it from, is often thought to be something that, well, I can't try that because I don't have enough skill. I don't know the right techniques. Can I say that in my experience, the key to drawing a scene with this much complex detail is not our technique skills, but it's our understanding of the process that we're going to draw it from. And the process is much simpler than we would think. And so with the right thinking, the right understanding, these sorts of scenes are not as hard. Now, part of the problem is we think that we're copying this. And if we think that we're copying a photo, with some photos, depending on the subjects, that may not be a difficult or an unhelpful way of thinking. But when we have a scene such as this, where we can see so much detail, some of it clearly, some of it less clearly, how do we ever possibly draw all that detail? And so the idea that drawing is just copying is less helpful. But if we think that what we're doing when we draw is we're seeing a certain effect, we see a certain amount in a certain way at a glance, and we're trying to reproduce that effect, then that becomes far more achievable in what we draw. Now, can I say, you're watching me draw this a little bit faster than my real actual time speed, but only a quarter as much again. So I am drawing this pretty quickly in life. Now, let me explain now the way I'm seeing this, and then the marks I'm making and the way I'm thinking. Now, whenever we're drawing detail, the important thing is that the closest parts we draw in more detail. And so in this case, it's what I'm choosing to start with. And I almost always start with that place of more detail. It's this lower section of the building, and we see it in more detail because it's in the center, which is our focal point, at least our starting focal point when we see a scene. But therefore, that detail is closer to us. And also, in terms of the actual architecture and ornamentation, this is a simpler area. We don't have the statues here. We really have arches and columns and windows. And so that means because there's less detail, it's easier to see what's happening. So I start with this. You'll notice in my drawing, I've left a space for that dark lamp that is in front, the lamp post that's quite a bit in closer than that building. Now, the important thing with architecture and drawing the effect of architecture, and we're going to use the same principle, the same process for the tree and for the leaves, because that's another example where there's more detail than we can actually draw in detail, than we can draw accurately, than we can copy leaf for leaf. But in terms of architecture, the important thing is we get our perspective angles correct, especially when we have a foreshortened view such as this, where the building slopes away from us and the horizontal lines angle, and they angle more and more as they go above eye level. That's important that I get those angles correct. And you'll have noticed when I started, the very first thing I did was basically a row of dotted lines to indicate that. Now just notice in my drawing again, I've drawn that sign that's in front. We're actually looking at one of those very, very characteristic French street signs, or a series of signs. We're looking at it end on, so we don't see the longer part that has the writing. We're just seeing the width of it. So I start with drawing something where I draw more detail, and I make sure that my perspective angles, because it's architecture, are still accurate. And I also need to make sure my foreshortening is accurate. And the foreshortening is the fact that things become narrower as they move further away from us. So the challenge then is to draw what counts. Now, with grand architecture such as this, the important thing, what we actually see is more the depth of insets, of recesses. So we may see columns because they stand out from the wall, but we also often, because these buildings have very thick walls, and again, depending on the angle we're looking at it from, we see the depth down one side. In this case, we're seeing the depth of all of these recesses or that go into the wall of the building on the left-hand side. We can't see the right-hand side. If we look at all of those quarter circles, that's because that's an arch. But we only see basically half of the arch because the arch is set back and the other half is hidden by the part of the wall that's in front of it. And so I need to see that and not be tempted to draw arches, because at a glance I can think, oh, they're arches. And before I know it, I've started to draw arches instead of observing and thinking, in this particular case, the arches are only half visible. Now, I'm also establishing, and look what I'm doing. Once on the ground floor, I've moved along and I've established a certain amount of width. Now I can go up. And going up is easier because I've worked it out already. I just need to work out how high it's going to go. Now, if we look at the section I'm doing now in the photo, what's the most obvious thing? The most obvious thing are these long columns, and that's because they don't have much detail on them. They don't have any detail on them. And so I see them more easily. Then the other thing I see are these horizontal bands that, perspective-wise, fit into the angles of the line below and above. And these are actually little pedestals that come out from the wall that have statues on them, that have figures on them. And so you can see what I've done. I've done a few marks to indicate the lower section of marks the base of the pedestal, and then a series of other marks to indicate some more architecture. And now I've done some little squiggle marks to indicate the statues. And there's a bit more detail under those protruding pedestals, some brackets, and now I'm doing those brackets. And notice that when I do the detail, I do the detail, just the small amount of detail in a straight line across the whole section that I'm drawing. That way, I ensure that every repeated section of architectural element, in this case, between the columns, the protruding pedestal and the bracket and the statue and the other architectural decorations alongside and above, all are the same. The important thing is that they all look the same, because when we look in our reference, the effect is one of sameness. So in my drawing, I want the effect to be one of sameness. And so can you see how if I'd done each section between those columns one by one, I wouldn't have had them all looking so identical as I have. So that's an important part as well. Working out beforehand the best order in which to do this. And so now I'm moving down the building, and when I look at the section I'm drawing now, what I see is there are two wider blank bits. And that's because there's a section of the building now that protrudes towards the front, and there's no decoration on the side of that protruding part. So that creates a blank section, and that's good to get. And again, these are the sections that I make sure proportion-wise I'm starting to do them the right distance apart. I also look, as well as going down along the lines, the perspective angles, I'm also simply looking at the horizontal distance from one part to another. Now, look at what I'm doing now. I'm doing little squiggles to represent different architectural features. Now, in a moment, you will see there is a moment where a bit of this appears, because I turned off the camera and went and did something, came back and didn't turn the camera back on for 5 minutes. But it'll be a few minutes before that happens, I think, but just so you're not surprised too much. And so you can see now I'm doing the overhanging cornice. And the important thing is to get a sense of overhang and to draw those shadows. When we have detail, architectural detail such as this, a lot of the time we're actually drawing the shadows more than the detail, because it's the shadows that stand out and we're drawing what stands out. And again, just keep looking at in the reference what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. Now, what I'm drawing now are a lot of sculptural groups, a lot of architectural figures. And with those, it's important not to try and draw little figures, but to just get a sense of the shapes and the lines and the angles of what we can see in our reference, the main ones, and simply try and replicate them. Now, look at the tree. I ummed and ahed about this as to whether to make the tree very dark or very light. I decided to go dark because in terms of values, the tree is pretty much the darkest thing we can see here. If we were to take all the colour out, I think, except for perhaps that gentleman's jeans in the lower left, the tree would be the darkest place. But because of all the detail, my facade of the Hotel de Ville in Paris here is going to look a bit lighter, a bit darker than the effect of the edges, because a line, my ink lines, are thicker visually than the edges that we see in our drawing. And we always have to, if possible, allow for that. If not possible, compensate for that. So we had that little bit of magic, and the parts that I did after I'd come back have just popped into place. Now, when we talked about the perspective angles need to be correct, it's really, really important that we get the angles lined up for things that aren't actually a horizontal line, but where things come up to the same height if we're looking straight on, such as these chimneys, because they're going to angle, if you join them all up, in the same pattern, in the same fan-shaped pattern of all the horizontal lines underneath. So as you can see, despite all the detail, this isn't taking a huge amount of time. I mean, this is going to take, basically 30 minutes to watch instead of the 40 minutes it took me to draw in life. So this technique is actually a great one, and it does enable us to draw a lot of detail quickly, because I'm never drawing all of the detail. I'm trying to capture the feel of how it looks. And so where there's little fussy bits visually, I'm putting ink marks to create little fussy bits, but I'm not trying to draw the actual detail I see. I'm just trying to draw the detail of little fussy bits. But I'm trying to position them. It's the positioning of these marks that's important, where they line up on the perspective, and they're also in the right proportions for the space that they're in. So things like the capitals, the fancy bits on the tops of columns, I'm not trying to actually draw those, I'm just doing a few little dots and tiny dashes to indicate. So look at this statue. That's a statue in a niche I just drew. And I hope you can agree that there is a sense of a statue in a niche there if we look carefully. But the truth is, when we look at this finished drawing, we're not going to be looking carefully and saying, oh, that's a statue in a niche. We're going to be looking at the whole building, and we just have a sense that this is part of a lot of complex ornamentation, that it will make sense in a generalized way rather than an exact way. Now, the important thing with this is that I keep the perspective and the foreshortening correct. And that includes the angles on these roofs, and also the decoration that we have in these dormer windows, very fancy dormer windows that have carved stone front windows. And you can see there I'm just trying to get the angle correct with a bit of muscle memory and align things correctly. Now, if I were trying to draw the detail, I would be trying to look at the actual patterns and figures and see as much as I can and start to draw them. But when I'm looking at the effect of the detail in my photo, so that I can just capture that effect with some marks, I'm more looking at the overall shape. So they Are they boxy? Are they roundish? Are they swirly? Are they geometric? And how does the perspective, how does the angle I'm viewing this from affect it? How is the foreshortening affecting it? If I'm viewing this at an angle, do I see the detail on one side more than on the other side of each little section of pattern? So now we have this, I think, rather wonderful little decorative tower. This is one of my favourite little architectural towers, I think, anywhere. I always like this one. It's not the easiest one to draw, but I really like it. I just think it's such an impressive statement. And again, you look closely at my marks there, and in a sense, there is certainly a looseness in them, and I could certainly probably almost correct every mark I've put there. But overall, it creates the feel in a way that fits in with the rest of the drawing. So, pretty well done most of the architecture. And now I have the challenging part of ground level, and it's really easy to get into, I think, a very poor habit of finishing the drawing like this. Now, as a one-off, it can look quite impressive. I think you'd want to finish the tree, but maybe you could leave it like this. And that certainly focuses on the architecture. But if the reason we don't finish this is because we're thinking, oh, I can't draw the people, or it's too complicated, too many things, then that's not a good reason to stop, because we always want to be challenging our skills, be pushing ourselves forward, because in the end, we want to learn how to draw, and it's not really the subject that's so important. If we learn to draw, we can virtually draw anything. Now, individual subjects have their particular challenges, and we don't become familiar with those unless we draw the same subject over and over again. But the principles of drawing don't change, whether I'm drawing the Hotel de Ville, or a portrait, or a puppy dog, or crashing waves on the beach. Some subjects are going to require more work, I suspect, just by the nature of what we have to capture, but the underlying principles are the same. It all comes down to having a process of understanding what we're doing when we're drawing. And for me, that process is that understanding is that I'm translating a photo into a drawing. And that's why copying is such an ineffective or insufficient way of understanding, because when you translate, sometimes things translate fairly directly, and they're the things that you can copy reasonably well, but sometimes you've got to say the same thing in a different way in the new language. And that's where copying lets us down. And so my technique of drawing the effect of detail is where we're translating what we see, we're speaking it now totally differently, using different grammar and different words completely. It's not a simple one-for-one translation. Now we have this closest bit of the architecture, and I need to try and keep that looking clearer, because we can see these clearer things more closely. And we can see more of the arches here now, because we're looking at these ones more front on and less side on. It's not just that as the arches go further away, we only see half of them, but what we actually see changes in each little section. It's not so obvious here, but it is more obvious in some buildings and some scenes. Now, I'm applying exactly the same principle of drawing the effect of detail to this tree and to the foliage. What I'm not trying to do is to draw leaves. What I want to do is to build up the value, the darkness, and particularly paying attention to the silhouette edges, because our brain goes to edges to see things and understand what we're looking at more quickly, and then make assumptions about the rest of what it is. So the bits where we read information most carefully, edges, particularly with trees. Now in this case, the leaves are silhouetted against a lot of ink. So it's not going to quite work quite as obviously. But you can imagine if this tree had the blue sky behind it, then the edges would very much show up. And what I'm really looking for, even though overall this whole tree foliage canopy is going to be a dark value, some parts are darker than others, and I want to reflect that in my scene because that will help give a sense of the three dimensions of this tree. I want this tree not to feel like a cut-out pattern stuck on top, but an actual rounded subject. And notice with my hatching lines on the trunk, I've done them horizontally. And that does a couple of things. One is it stands in contrast to the very much vertical emphasis of my architecture lines, but also it stands in contrast to the more vertical than anything else hatching of my foliage canopy. And so it just lets us see instantly, oh, this is different from the architecture and it's different from the leaves. And I think it also echoes the fact that these trunks are cylinders. And in a way, these horizontal hatch marks are reflecting the circular shape. It's almost as if we're cutting a what do you call it when you cut through something and you see one slice of it? I'm sure it will come to me when I've finished. So now back to the architecture now, because I couldn't really finish the architecture until I got that part of the tree in. And now you can see me just doing the effect of the detail up the top there. And again, see how I'm basically drawing the shadows there? So I keep looking back and forth from my reference and think, what can I see? And now I have this shallow relief that stands out. And the main thing I kind of get from this is there's a circle and there are some little sort of round blobby bits around the base. And there, that will do. And one of the principles I have when I draw a scene generally, and that includes a scene such as this, is that the detail that's at the edges of our scene, so more at the periphery of what we're doing, I draw even more loosely than the detail I draw in the focal point. And so that's probably the most peripheral, that chimney, even though it's quite close, it's probably the most peripheral architectural detail. And so now I'm filling in the gaps on the tree. I find with a tree such as this, when I have a tree that's going to actually take a reasonable chunk of the overall drawing time simply because of the amount of black ink I have to put on the paper, I often do break it into several goes because I find that I do it better that way. That if I try and do a lot of canopy all at once, I tend to start rushing it and the last parts aren't done as well as the first part. So I find that by doing a bit, doing something else, come back and doing a bit, go do something else, and so forth until it's eventually finished, I do a better job overall. Now, what I hope I'm going to do is to leave a little bit of a very slight gap between the architecture behind this tree trunk and the tree trunk. So hopefully not all the lines will come right up hard against it, and I leave a bit of a halo effect, I call it. Almost like there's a little bit of light bouncing around behind, and it just strengthens the feeling that this tree trunk is closer to us. And that's why it is important to draw the closest things first. And sometimes that means if we, as we are doing here, are drawing something in the mid-ground, in the mid-distance, we need to sometimes stop doing that just to draw in the closest things, such as that lamppost, the edge on signposts, and these lamps, the tops of street lamps down the bottom. Now we have that dark round street sculpture. So that was a nice little detail to add. And now I've got the challenge of this foreground. And I often see drawings where clearly the architecture has been what's grabbed the attention of the person who's drawn it. It's what they've wanted to draw, and they've done it well. But the other elements, quite frankly, just aren't drawn to the same level. And it's often because when there's something that doesn't interest us as much, it's easy not to appreciate the fact that they're going to be, for someone looking at our drawing, just as important a part of the drawing as the parts that did interest us. And if we don't draw them well, then people are going to notice that they're not drawn well. And we've now spoilt what we have drawn well, or at least drawn better. It's like if a performer sings and gets one wrong note, when they walk away, the audience is going to be remembering that one wrong note, not the hundreds or thousands of right notes. So we want to take the same care in all the parts of our drawing. And we have the challenge of the figures, and particularly this railing that is at the bottom right section stretching back. It's important, and it's going to follow the same perspective angle pattern, the same fan shape pattern. Now, one thing we always do at the start of a drawing is to find where the eye level is, because that's where these angled perspective lines actually are where we're going to have a straight line instead of an angle. And if I look at this, I can see that with this railing at the bottom, the lines angle upwards. And if I look at that, one of those first main sort of perspective angles I drew at the top of that center section, it's angling the other way. So the horizontal line is going to be between the two. If I look at the top line of that fence down the bottom, that railing, it's not very angled, it's getting close to horizontal. So therefore, the horizontal line will be close to that. And in the end, it's basically, in this case, where the heads are. And that's because I'm standing on that same flat ground, and I'm about the same height that the people in it are. We're all pretty average, I think. So the actual horizontal line is going to be somewhere where those eyes are, or those figures, maybe slightly above. And so that means above that, all the horizontal lines angle slightly upwards, increasingly upwards as they get higher, and the opposite when they go below that. So I'm drawing these figures, and if you look to see what I'm doing, again, I'm drawing the effect of the figures. I'm not trying to draw little figures. I'm really reducing these to shapes. So I'm looking at the reference, and I'm trying to see shapes in a certain proportion to each other. I particularly with the arms and the legs, don't want to start putting too much detail in. I read once that 2 limbs bent once each is more than enough activity for figures in this sort of context. That the more bends we make, the harder it's going to be to get them all in relationship correctly to each other. And therefore the easier it's going to be for our figure to look distorted. So as a principle, I will have one leg bent and one arm bent and all, but never more, unless there's some really important reason why I need to. And by keeping it simpler, I have far more chance that my figures are going to look like they could be human at the end. And remember, that's what I want. I want the effect of a figure more than the actual precise detail of a figure that's everything's bent slightly or a lot. And I want something that looks like a figure at a glance. But not just a stiff figure. I want my figures to feel like they're walking, to feel like there's a leg that's moving or an arm that's moving. Now, you can see me now positioned in this fence, and notice the foreshortening of these main uprights, because as they move further away from me, they're going to appear to get closer. And that's what I've done. And I'm going to draw this detailing pretty roughly, because I want to draw the effect of it, not the detail. So whatever I'm drawing, the important thing is capturing the perspective, capturing the foreshortening. So all of these gaps get larger as they move closer towards me. But the angles that the decoration form needs to be correctly angled. So see the gaps between those bits at the very bottom right corner and these bits now, how the gaps get wider. That's the key thing, or they get closer together as they move away. That's what's going to matter, rather than drawing all of the detail that I can see, particularly in the closest parts of this fence. So as you can see, I'm using this principle of drawing the effect of the detail. See, I just did the effect of the letter in then. Did you notice that above their heads? Have a look at the reference. In everything I draw, in fact, I'm drawing the effect of what I see. I'm not trying to draw precisely. And when we have this mentality that I'm copying the photo, that leads me to try and draw things precisely, because that's what you do when you copy. You draw things precisely. But that's when, oh dear, look at that dirty fingernail. I'm sorry about that. I often do a bit of vegetable gardening in between drawing, and sometimes I just don't notice my fingernails when I start drawing and put the camera on. But what I'm doing also is I'm putting my finger on the reference so that I can see what I'm looking at quickly, so that it's easy to connect with the part of the scene that I'm drawing. But so for everything here, I'm drawing the effect of the detail, not just the architecture, but the foliage, the tree canopy, the figures, the close street furniture, such as this railing here, the truck that's parked behind that I think has got food in it. It's all the same principle. Once I free myself from thinking I'm copying the photo, my mind is now much freer to find more realistic techniques that do capture realism a whole lot more. And now the shadows. Don't forget the shadows, they're really important, but make sure they've all got an angle in the right relationship to each other. And the angles is affected by perspective as well. So now we just zip this off and we're done. What do you think? If you want to have a go drawing this, I will post it on my posts page, the old community page, and you can have a go putting the effect of drawing architectural detail by drawing the effect, not by drawing all the detail itself. Please hit the like button for me if you found this helpful. And now we have the bits and pieces, final details that I realized I haven't done, just to give a sense of realism to it. Now, I ummed and ahed about whether doing this, there was actually a bit of a gap there that I did cut out. I'm doing this hatching now to represent the colour. And if I could go back, I think I would leave it white because I think it reads better as white. It just helps us to see the roof more clearly. Tell me what you think in the comments, whether you think you agree with me or whether you think putting these lines on to indicate the colour was helpful. Perhaps I should have just made the lines a little bit lighter, but more of them to create a more even, darker value. These are the things we learn from, though. Always look at our drawing at the end and think, what should I have done differently? Because we can then take that as experience into our next drawing. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you've got to this stage, thank you. But I do think this is a nice little drawing. It is complicated, and I was happy with how it turned out. And I was happy that it was a good architectural demonstration of drawing the effect of detail, not the actual detail. Once we can learn to think this way, to sort of understand our drawing process, not as copying, but as capturing effect, it really frees us up to do a lot of new things. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Thanks for persevering till now. Hope you have a go drawing this, but whatever you draw, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.